In the heart of Igbo land, nestled among rolling hills and lush forests, the kingdom of Arochukwu thrived. It was a prosperous land, abundant with natural resources, where rivers flowed with fresh water, and the soil was rich with crops. The people of Arochukwu lived in harmony, their lives intertwined with the land and its seasons. The kingdom was ruled by a mighty king, Chukwudi, whose wisdom and fairness were known throughout the land. King Chukwudi was a tall man, with eyes that sparkled with ambition and strength. His presence commanded respect, yet his heart carried a deep longing, a longing that had consumed him for many years. Despite all his achievements, the king felt incomplete. He had a beautiful wife, Adiz, a woman of grace and intelligence, but they had no son to inherit the throne. The kingdom was large, and the pressure to secure the future of the kingdom weighed heavily on the king's shoulders. From the very beginning, King Chukwudi and Adiz had been inseparable. They had grown up together, sharing laughter and dreams. Their bond was unbreakable. Adiz had given him many daughters, beautiful, smart, and strong-willed young girls, each with their own unique gifts. But the king could not shake the feeling that his legacy would be in jeopardy without a male heir. The kingdom needed a son to inherit the throne, to continue the royal bloodline, to carry the weight of the crown. As the years passed, the king's desire for a son grew stronger. The people of Arochukwu began to whisper behind closed doors. "Why has the king not yet fathered a son?" they asked. "Is there something wrong with him? Or with the queen?" These murmurs reached the ears of the king, and he grew increasingly anxious. Every time Adiz gave birth to another daughter, his heart sank deeper into despair. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the king called for his council. His advisors, wise and experienced men from all corners of the kingdom, gathered around him. The king's face was etched with worry as he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Have I failed my people? Is my reign not enough? Why has the gods not blessed me with a son?" he asked, his voice cracking with frustration. The council sat in silence, their eyes filled with sympathy but their mouths sealed. They had no answers, for no one could explain the king's plight. After a long pause, one of the elders, a man named Chukwudi, spoke softly. "Your Majesty, I have heard of a woman in the distant forest, a healer and herbalist. Her name is Neka. She has helped many couples in this land conceive. Perhaps she might hold the answer to your troubles." The king's eyes sparkled with hope. "Bring her to me," he ordered. Within a few days, Neka arrived at the royal palace. She was a woman of remarkable calm, her demeanor regal yet humble. Her face was lined with the wisdom of age, and her eyes carried the weight of many lifetimes. She spoke little but was known to be a woman whose knowledge of herbs and nature was unmatched. When she met with the king, she listened carefully to his plea. She heard the sorrow in his voice and saw the desperation in his eyes. After a long pause, she spoke in a soft, measured tone. "Your Majesty, I have heard your pain. But there is no magic that will bring you what you desire. There is only nature, the earth, and the cycles of life. You must trust in this." The king was frustrated by her words. "But what of my lineage? What of my kingdom? I need a son." Neka smiled gently. "Your son will come when the time is right. But you must not force nature. You must trust in it and honor its rhythm." With those words, she gave him a mixture of herbs and instructed him to give them to his wife, Adiz. She spoke of patience, and for the first time, the king felt a flicker of hope. He agreed to follow the herbalist's advice, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, but still Adiz did not bear him a son. Each time she gave birth to a daughter, the king's despair deepened. He began to question whether there was something wrong with him. "What have I done to deserve this?" he would ask himself. One evening, in the silence of his palace, King Chukwudi sat alone in his chambers. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the room, and the king's thoughts swirled like a storm. In that moment, a thought entered his mind, a desperate, consuming thought. If one wife cannot bear me a son, perhaps more will. It was a reckless thought, born from desperation, but the king could not shake it. His mind raced, and he decided that he would marry more women, one after another, until he found one who would give him the heir he so desperately needed. And so, King Chukwudi began to take new wives. One by one, he brought women from neighboring kingdoms, daughters of noblemen, traders, and warriors. They came from lands far and near, each marriage filled with hope that this one would bring him the son he longed for. But, to his disappointment, each new wife bore him only daughters. As King Chukwudi's obsession with fathering a son deepened, the palace of Arochukwu transformed from a place of peace and order into a chaotic, crowded, and frenzied environment. His many marriages, once hopeful beginnings, quickly became a tangled web of rivalry, jealousy, and frustration. The royal compound, once vast and serene, was now packed with women and children, each vying for the king's attention, each harboring their own hopes of bearing him a son. The palace was now a maze of rooms, each inhabited by a different wife and her children. The walls echoed with the sounds of crying babies, children playing, and heated arguments between wives. The once tranquil courtyard, where the king used to stroll alone to find peace, was now filled with children running in all directions, chasing one another, creating a cacophony of noise that never seemed to stop. One day, a particularly hot and humid afternoon, a dramatic scene unfolded that would forever change the atmosphere of the palace. It began when one of the king's youngest wives, Nkiru, a fiery woman from the distant hills, overheard her co-wife, Shinonso, boasting to another wife about how the king had promised her a special gift for bearing him another daughter. Nkiru, already on edge from years of frustration at not being able to bear a son, erupted in anger. "You think the king values you more than me?" Nkiru shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of the palace. "You think your daughter is better than my own? How dare you speak of him in such a way?" Shinonso, a quiet and graceful woman, was taken aback by the outburst but refused to be intimidated. "I do not boast of anything, Nkiru. It is you who speak of the king's promises as if you know them all," she replied coolly. But the damage was done. The words were out, and they ignited a firestorm. The other wives, who had been listening from nearby rooms, rushed in, eager to witness the drama that was about to unfold. They were quick to pick sides, fueling the flames of rivalry and resentment that had been simmering for years. Within moments, the royal courtyard was alive with shouting, finger-pointing, and accusations. Nkiru began to push Shinonso, her face flushed with rage, and the others quickly joined in, each throwing verbal jabs at one another. The children, who had been playing innocently nearby, were startled by the noise and began to cry, adding to the chaos. "Enough!" Nkiru screamed, her hands trembling with fury. "If I cannot bear the king a son, I will make sure no one else does either." In the midst of the shouting, one of the king's daughters, Ezin, rushed into the courtyard. Ezin was a sharp and confident young woman, wise beyond her years, and she had seen the growing tension between the wives. She had been taught by her father that peace and wisdom were the true rulers of a kingdom, not force. "Stop this madness," she cried, her voice strong and commanding. "This palace is a place of honor, not a battleground. Father will not stand for this." But her words fell on deaf ears. The bickering wives, their emotions now completely unrestrained, continued their fight. Ezin could see the damage it was causing, the division, the bitterness, the resentment that was poisoning the very heart of the palace. In the distance, she saw her father, King Chukwudi, returning from his morning ride, his face weary and burdened as always by the weight of his kingdom. But today, the weight of his personal life would break through. King Chukwudi stepped into the courtyard, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He stood there, taking in the scene before him, his wives, his daughters, his children, all shouting and pointing at one another. His heart sank. How had it come to this? The palace, once a symbol of unity, was now a place of discord. His quest for a son, his obsession with a male heir, had torn the very fabric of his kingdom apart. Enough. King Chukwudi's voice rang out, a commanding presence that silenced the chaos. His eyes, though tired, burned with authority as he surveyed the madness before him. What is this madness? Have I raised you all to behave like this? The wives fell silent, looking away from one another as shame washed over them. Even Kiru, her chest heaving with rage, stepped back, realizing the king had entered. But the tension still lingered, thick in the air. King Chukwudi walked toward them, his steps heavy with disappointment. What have I done to bring this chaos into my home? You are all women of worth, women who were chosen to be the light of my house, but now you act like children in the marketplace. His eyes narrowed as he turned to Nkiru and Shinonso. And you, Nkiru, you have brought shame to yourself. Jealousy and rivalry have no place here. We are a family. A family united in love and respect, not divided by petty competition. Nkiru lowered her head, her pride wounded, but she remained silent. She had thought that her struggle to bear a son would earn her the king's favor, but in her desperation, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. Shinonso, too, stepped forward, her voice trembling with regret. I did not mean to boast, Your Majesty. It was a foolish mistake. The king looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. You too, Shinonso, have forgotten the true purpose of our union. This is not a competition. You are all equal in my eyes, but none of you will win my heart through rivalry. He turned to Ezin, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of concern and disappointment. My daughter, you are right. We have lost our way. This palace, once a sanctuary, has become a battleground. And it is I who have allowed it to happen. With that, King Chukwudi dismissed the wives and children, ordering them to return to their chambers and reflect on the chaos they had caused. As they dispersed, the air remained thick with unresolved emotions, but at least the shouting had stopped. The king retired to his chambers, his heart heavy with regret. With each marriage, the king grew more obsessed. He married women from distant lands, women from the mountains, women from the riversides. His palace became overcrowded with women, each of them carrying the weight of his expectations. But still, no son came. The king's frustration reached a boiling point, and he began to cast away the wives who could not bear him a son. He sent them back to their families, their hearts broken and their pride bruised. Return to your homes, the king would say coldly. You have failed me. The palace, once filled with laughter, now echoed with silence. King Chukwudi's obsession with finding a son consumed him completely. He no longer sought the advice of his elders or consulted Neka, the herbalist. His mind was fixed on one goal, to marry more wives and to continue until he had a son, no matter the cost. The people of Arochukwu, who had once celebrated the king's wisdom and strength, began to speak in hushed tones. What is happening to our king? They wondered. Why does he not see the beauty in his daughters? Why is he so fixated on this son? As the years passed, King Chukwudi's marriages grew in number, and his palace became a maze of women and children. There were so many wives that it was difficult to keep count. He married and remarried, always seeking that elusive son. But despite all his efforts, no son came. One day, an old man appeared at the gates of the palace. He was bent with age, his clothes tattered but his eyes sharp. He asked to speak with the king. Your Majesty, the old man said, I have seen many kings in my time. I have watched them rise and fall, and I have seen many with your problem. But I will tell you this, your obsession with a son has blinded you. You are not seeing the gifts you already have. The king, weary from years of disappointment, listened in silence. The old man continued, "You have many daughters, each of them a reflection of your greatness. Your legacy does not lie in the number of sons you have, but in the strength of the women who will one day lead this kingdom." The words struck the king like a thunderclap. He had been so consumed with his desire for a son that he had failed to see the wisdom in his daughters. They were strong, capable, and wise. They had inherited the best qualities of their mother and father, and they were more than capable of carrying on the king's legacy. King Chukwudi looked around at his many wives and children. For the first time in years, he saw his daughters not as a disappointment, but as his true legacy. He called for a grand feast, where he invited all his wives, his daughters, his advisors, and the people of Arochukwu. At the feast, the king stood before the people and spoke with great emotion. "I have sought a son for many years," he said, "but I now see that my true legacy lies not in the bloodline I sought, but in the strength of my daughters. They will lead this kingdom with wisdom, and they will carry my name forward." From that day on, King Chukwudi ruled with a renewed sense of purpose. His daughters, once overlooked, were now celebrated as the true heirs of his kingdom. The people of Arochukwu rejoiced, and the king's heart was finally at peace. King Chukwudi learned that a king's legacy is not determined by the number of sons he has, but by the strength and wisdom of the people he leaves behind. And so, the kingdom of Arochukwu flourished, not because of a son, but because of the unity, love, and wisdom that had always been its true inheritance. The end. If you find this video interesting, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share for more interesting stories from TaleTrek.